How's it going? So the last time that I read some Peter Sloterdijk's Critique of Pure Reason, I read the first section of the preface. So I read the preface and I also wrote the second section, which is the occasion. And today I'm going to read the reason. If it is discontent in our culture that provokes criticism, there would be no age quite so disposed to criticism as ours. Yet the critical impulse has never been more strongly inclined to let itself be overpowered by a sour temperament. The tension between what wants to criticize and what should be criticized is so taut that our thinking is becoming much more morose than precise. No capacity of thought keeps pace with what is problematic. Hence the self-abnegation of critique. In the utter indifference towards all problems lies the ultimate premonition of how it would be to be their equal. Because everything has become problematic. Everything is also somehow a matter of indifference. This thread should be followed. It leads to a place where one can speak of cynicism and cynical reason. To speak of cynicism means to expose a spiritual and moral scandal to critique. Following that, the conditions for the possibility of the scandalous are unraveled. Critique undergoes a movement that at first fully lives out its positive and negative interest in the object, only in the end to run up against elementary structures of moral consciousness that are brought to expression beyond good and evil. The times are cynical everywhere you turn, and it is time to develop the connection between cynicism and realism from first principles. What did Oscar Wilde mean by his blasé statement, "I am not at all cynical, I am only experienced"? That's pretty much the same thing. Or Anton Chekhov's, who gloomily remarked, "No cynicism can outdo life." In the course of reflection, the well-known ambiguity in the concept of critique breaks down. At first, it means to make and subordinate judgments, to judge, to condemn, then to investigate the foundations for the formation of judgments. However, if one is talking about cynical reason, then initially this formula completely takes over behind irony, takes cover behind irony. So what can critique achieve today? What can it still hope for in the time that is so sick of theory? Let us hear Walter Benjamin's answer. Fools who complain about the demise of critique, for its time has long since run out. Critique is a matter of proper distance. It is at home in a world where perspectives and prospects are important and where it was possible to assume a point of view. In the meantime, things have become much too close for comfort for human society. Disinterestedness, the unbiased perspective have become lies, if not the completely naive expression of plain incompetence. In a system that feels like a cross between prison and chaos, there is no standpoint for a description, no central perspective for a compelling critique. In the shattered world of multiple perspectives, the grand narratives of the whole, in fact, belong more to simple souls than to those who are enlightened and educated by the given order of things. No enlightenment can occur without destroying the effect, thinking from a point of view, and without dissolving conventional morals. Psychologically, this goes hand in hand with a scattering of the ego, literally and philosophically with the demise of critique. How is the contradiction to be explained that the most important renaissance of critique in the 20th century is connected with the name of Walter Benjamin, who, on the one hand, convincingly demonstrated that critique's hour had come, and on the other hand, participated with such far-reaching impact in the school of critical theory? It is possible, so he says, to assume a standpoint because things have become much too close for comfort for us. But from a standpoint of having no standpoint, which has still to be more closely defined. Critique has made impressive progress. From where then does critique speak? From what perspective? And in whose name? I believe that critical theory has found a provisional ego for critique and a standpoint that provides it with perspectives for a truly incisive critique, a standpoint that conventional epistemology does not consider. I'm inclined to call it a priori pain. It is not the basis of elevated distance critique that achieves grand overviews, but a stance of extreme closeness, microology. If things have become too close for comfort for us, a critique must arise that expresses this discomfort. It is not a matter of proper distance, but of proper proximity. The success of the world concernedness grows from this soil. It is the seed of critical theory and germinates in new forms today, even among those who have scarcely heard it. Regarding the concerned, would it not be fascinating to find out where they get their critical model? Anyway, in the manner of their being concerned, the defects of the forgotten source reappear. Because the sovereignty of minds is always false, the new critique prepares to slip from the mind into the whole body. Enlightenment tries to move from the top to bottom, politico-culturally, as well as psychosomatically. To discover the living body as a censor of the world is to secure a realistic foundation for philosophical knowledge of the world. This is what critical theory had begun to do. Hesitatingly, often aesthetically encoded, hidden in all kinds of squeamishness. Critical theory was based on the presumption that we know this world a priori, through Weltschmerz, through Weltschmerz. What we perceive of the world can be ordered in psychosomatic coordinates of pain and pleasure. In holding this view, critical theory makes the usual elitist assumption of an intact sensibility. This characterizes its strengths and its weaknesses. It establishes its truth and restricts the scope of its validity. One must in fact be able to muster so much elitist sensibility. It is nourished by an aversion to the deadly poison of normality in a country of hard heads and armored souls. One should not even try to convince certain opponents. There is a generality of truth that is an alibi for lack of understanding. Where the capacity for reason is not based on sensitive self-reflection, no argumentation, not even one based on the most solid theory of communication, will be able to bring it about. On this sensitive point, critical theory was never able to get along with the logicians among its opponents. To be sure, there are thinkers whose minds are so energetic, whose nervous structures are so hardened, that to them, the entire approach of critical theory must seem lachrymose. Sensitive theory is suspect, in fact. Its founders, especially Adorno, had an exclusively narrow concept of the sensitive, a presupposition of the highest spiritual irresactability and aesthetic schooling that should never be rationalized. Its aesthetics ran just along the threshold of nausea toward everything and anything. There was scarcely anything that took place in the practical world that did not inflict pain, or was spared being suspect to brutality. But everything was somehow chained like an accomplice to false living, in which there is no true living. Above all, it suspected everything that seemed to be pleasure and consent as being swindle, relapse, and false relief. It was inevitable that critical theory, particularly in the person of Adorno, came to feel the backlash of its exaggerations. The embodying of reason for which it had prepared the ground for the highest sensibility could not stop at the limits within which it was constrained by its initiators. What is happening today shows how many faces critique issuing from bodily vitality can assume. Adorno belonged to the pioneers of a renewed critique of cognition that assumes an emotional a priori. In this theory, the motives of a crypto-Buddhist spirit are at work. Those who suffer without becoming hardened will understand. Those who can hear music in moments of clarity see across to the other side of the world. The conviction that the real is written in the hand of the suffering, coldness, and hardness determines the way this philosophy approaches the world. Although it scarcely believed in a change for the better, it did not give in to the temptation to desensitize itself or to get used to giving to the given order of things. To remain sensitive was, as it were, a utopian stance, to keep the senses sharpened for a happiness that will not come, a stance that nevertheless, by being prepared for happiness, protects us from the worst kinds of brutalism or brutalization. Politically, and in its nerve endings, this aesthetic, this sensitive theory is based on a reproachful attitude composed of suffering, contempt, and rage against everything that has power. It makes itself into a mirror of the evil in the world of bourgeois coldness, of the principles of domination, of dirty business and its profit motive. It is the masculine world that it categorically rejects. It is inspired by an anarchic no to the world of the fathers, legislators, and profiteers. Its basic prejudice is that only evil power against the living can come from this world. That is the reason for the stagnation of critical theory. The offensive maneuver of refusing to collaborate has long been ineffective. The masochistic element has outdone the creative element. The impulse of critical theory is becoming mature enough to burst open the strictures of negativism. In its heyday, critical theory found its adherents among those who could instinctively share their a priori pain with it. Still, in a generation that began to discover what its parents had done or approved, there were many such people. And because they were many, there was one again in the mid-60s in Germany, a thin thread of political culture, public dispute about true living. The revival of the great impulse depends on a self-reflection by the intelligentsia that was once inspired by it. In this sensitive critique, there is a paralyzing resentment. The refusal nourishes itself on an archaic rage against masculinity, the cynical sense for facts exhibited by political as well as scientific positivists. Adorno's theory revolted against the collaborative traits embedded in the practical attitude. His theory thrived by means of a conceptual balancing act to counter a knowledge that would not be power. It took refuge in the realm of the mother, in the arts, and in coded longings. Pictures prohibited do not tread with the whole foot. Defensive thinking characterized its style, the attempt to defend the reverve, where memories of happiness are bound exclusively with the utopia of the feminine. In an early work, Adorno once disclosed his emotional epistemological secret, almost without camouflage. In a few heartstring lines, he wrote about crying in response to Schumpeter's music, about how tears and knowing are connected. This music makes us cry because we are not like it, not something complete which turns towards the lost sweetness of life like a distant quotation. Happiness can only be thought of as something lost, as a beautiful alien. It can not be anything more than a premonition that we approach with tears in our eyes without ever reaching. Everything else belongs to false living anyway. What dominates is the world of the fathers, who are always appallingly in agreement with the granite of abstraction now solidified into a system. With Adorno, the denial of the masculine went so far that he retained only one letter from his father's name, W, the path to the meadow, however, does not exactly have to be the wrong one. Since the dissolution of the student movement, we have been experiencing a lull in theory. There is, it is true, more erudition and sophistication than ever before, but the inspirations are sterile. The optimism of those days, that vital interest could be combined with efforts in social theory, has pretty much died out. Without this optimism, it becomes quickly apparent how boring sociology can be. For those in the enlightened camp, after the debacle of leftist actionism, terror, and its intensification in anti-terror, the world turned topsy-turvy. The Enlightenment camp wanted to make it possible for everyone to mourn German history, but ended in its own melancholy. Critique seems to have become even more impossible than Benjamin thought. The critical attitude turns nostalgically inward to a kind of philosophical gardening where Benjamin erises Paslonian flowers of evil and Freudian deadly nightshade are cultivated. Critique, in any sense of the word, is experiencing gloomy days. Once again, a period of pseudo-critique has begun, in which critical stances are subordinated to professional roles. Criticism, with limited liability, petty enlightenment as a factor in success, a stance at the junction of a new conformism and old ambitions. Already in Kurt Tukhowski's work in those days, the hollowness of a critique that tried to drown out its own disillusionment could be felt. Such a critique realizes that having success is a long way from having an effect. It writes brilliantly but in vain, and that can be heard through everything. From these almost universal experiences, the latent cynicism of present-day enlighteners are nourished. Pasloni spiced up the dull pseudo-critique a bit in that he at least designed a convincing costume, that of a buccaneer, pirate winging writings. The intellectual as buccaneer, not a bad dream. We have scarcely ever seen ourselves in that way, a homosexual gaze, the warning signal against the effemination of critique. Like Douglas Fairbanks, leaping around in the cultural rigging, with drawn sword, sometimes the conqueror and sometimes the conquered, knocked about unpredictably in the seas of social alienation. The blows fall on all sides. Because the costume is amoral, it fits morally like a second skin. The buccaneer cannot assume fixed standpoints because he is constantly moving between changing fronts. Perhaps Pasloni's image of the pirate intellect can reflect light on Brecht. I mean, on the young, bad Brecht, not the Brecht who believed he had to conduct classes on the communist galley. The offensive posture in the myth of the buccaneer is inviting. One reservation might be the illusion that the intelligentsia is based on brawling as such. In fact, Pasolini is a beaten person like Adorno. It is the a priori pain. It makes even the simplest things in life difficult for a person. That opens his eyes critically. There is no significant critique without significant defects. It is the critically wounded in a culture who, with great effort, find something healing, who continue to turn the wheel of critique. Adorno dedicated a well-known essay to Heinrich Heine, Die Wunde Heine, the sore Heine. This sore is nothing other than the one that bores away in a significant critique. Among the great critical achievements in modern times, sores open up everywhere. the Sohr Rousseau, the Sohr Schelling, the Sohr Heine, the Sohr Marx, the Sohr Kierkegaard, the Sohr Nietzsche, the Sohr Spengler, the Sohr Heidegger, the Sohr Theodor Lessing, the Sohr Freud, the Sohr Adorno. Out of the self-healing of deep sores comes critiques that serve epochs as rallying points for self-knowledge. Every critique is pioneering work on the pain of the themes and a piece of exemplary healing. It is not my ambition to enlarge this honorable infirmary of critical theories. It is time for a new critique of temperaments, where enlightenment appears as a melancholic science. It unintentionally furthers melancholic stagnation. Thus, the critique of cynical reason hopes to achieve more from a work that cheers up, whereby it is understood from the beginning that it is not so much a matter of work, but rather of relaxation. The motive. It will already have been noticed that the justification is a bit too deliberate to be quite true. I realize that I might be giving the impression that I am trying to save enlightenment and critical theory. The paradoxes of the rescue method will ensure that this first impression does not last. It might seem at first that enlightenment necessarily ends in critical disillusionment, but the page is soon turned and the investigation of cynicism becomes the foundation for a healthy freedom from illusions. Enlightenment was always disillusionment in the positive sense, and the more it advances, the closer the moment approaches when reason tells us to attempt an affirmation. A philosophy in the spirit of yes also includes the yes to the no. This is neither a cynical positivism nor an affirmative attitude. The yes, I mean, is not the yes of the defeated. If there is a trace of obedience in this yes, it is of the only kind of obedience that can be expected from enlightened people, namely the obedience of their own experience. European neurosis sees happiness as its goal and an effort of reason as a way to achieve it. This compulsion has to be overcome. The critical addiction to making things better has to be given up for the sake of the good, for which one so easily distances oneself on long marches. Ironically, the aim of the most critical effort is the most ingenious release. Shortly before Adorno died, there was a scene in a lecture hall at Frankfurt University that fits like a key into the analysis of cynicism begun here. The philosopher was just about to begin his lecture when a group of demonstrators prevented him from mounting the podium. Such scenes were not unusual in 1969. On this occasion, something happened that required a closer look. Among the disruptors were some female students who, in protest, attracted attention to themselves by exposing their breasts to the tinker. Here, on one side, stood naked flesh, exercising critique. There, on the other side, stood the bitterly disappointed man, without whom scarcely any of those present would have known that critique meant cynicism in action. It was not naked force that reduced the philosopher to muteness, but the force of the naked. Right and wrong, truth and falsity were inexorably mixed in this scene in a way that is critique typical for cynicisms. Cynicism ventures forth with naked truths that, in the way they are presented, contain something false. Wherever deceptions are constitutive for a culture, wherever life in society succumbs to a compulsion of lying, they're really speaking the truth has an element of aggression, an unwelcome exposure. Nevertheless, the instincts for discourse is stronger in the long run. Only a radical nakedness and bringing things out in the open can free us from the compulsion of mistrustful imputations. Wanting to get to the naked truth is one motive for a desperate seriousness, which wants to tear through the veil of conventions, lies, abstractions, and discretions. in order to get to the bottom of things. I want to pursue this theme. A mixture of cynicism, sexism, matter-of-factness, and psychologism constitutes the mood of the superstructure in the West. A twilight mood, good for elves and philosophy. At the bottom of my motivations is a childlike veneration for what, in the Greek sense, was called philosophy, for which, moreover, a family tradition of reverence is partly responsible. My grandmother, a teacher's daughter from an idealistic home, often recounted proudly and respectfully that it was Kant who wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, and Schopenhauer, The World as Will as Representation. And perhaps there are even more such magical books in the world that we cannot read because they are too difficult, but which we must admire from the outside, like something from someone very great. Is there no philosophy that does not screw our brains from our heads with its old bony hand? The dream that I pursue is to see the dying tree of philosophy bloom once again, in a blossoming without disillusionment, abundant with bizarre thought flowers, red, blue, whites shimmering in the colors of the beginning, as in the Greek dawn when theoria was beginning, and when, inconceivably and suddenly, like everything clear, understanding found its language. Are we really culturally too old to repeat such experiences? The reader is invited to sit for a while under this tree, which strictly speaking cannot exist. I promise nothing, above all, no new values. The Critique of Cynical Reason, to quote Heinrich Heine's characterization of the Aristophanean comedies, endeavors to pursue the deep idea of world annihilation on which the gay science is based, which from there, like a fantastically ironic magic tree, shoots up with blossoming thought ornaments, singing nightingale nests and clamoring monkeys. And that is the end of the preface for the Critique of Cynical Reason. Next time, we will be starting part 1, Sightings, 5 Preliminary Reflections, the Twilight of False Consciousness. See you next time.